Okay. Hello all. So welcome back yet again to CAIR Coalition's Thursdays at 3. We're so grateful for everyone who is tuning in and trying to, learn more about the detention, deportation system here and the legal services that CAIR Coalition is offering. Before we begin today's webinar, today we're going to talk about universal representation in immigration court. But the struggle for immigration justice and the struggle for racial justice are obviously inextricably linked. An example of that is that ICE and Customs and Border Patrol are actually standing alongside DC and federal police in DC right now in relation to the protests that are ongoing. If folks do get detained by ICE via these protests, it's possible that they will end up working alongside a CAIR Coalition Universal Representation team. So that's just kind of one example of how, these are linked and there are pipelines that exist connecting these things. And so we are going to talk about universal representation in immigration court today. But, I just want to share that for anyone who is trying to do the work to, educate themselves and stand in defense of Black lives, CAIR Coalition is going to be sharing a lot of resources to that end on our social medias, especially on our Twitter and on our Instagram. Resources from Black Lives Matter, resources from Lawyers for Black Lives, from the NAACP. So we encourage people to, we'll talk a little bit about how those systems interact today, but we encourage people to follow up via those resources. So we'll go ahead and, start talking about UREP. Just to lay the groundwork, there is no universal right to have an attorney in immigration court unless someone can pay for it themselves or an organization like CAIR Coalition steps in. And what that means is that only 14% of detained immigrants do have an attorney. So of the roughly 50,000 people detained by ICE, 43,000 of those on average will not have representation in immigration court. So today we're going to talk about CAIR Coalition's universal representation pilot programs and what they're doing to step up and fill that gap. So with me to discuss that, we have two fantastic members of UREP, that's short for Universal Representation teams. We have Lorna Julien, who is an attorney with our Washington, D.C. UREP team. And we have Laura de las Casas, who is here from our Prince George's UREP team. So I do just want to thank you guys, so much for being here. And to what we were just talking about, if we could start by just talking about the criminal system and the immigration system and putting those on the same plane and comparing them. So Laura, I know you worked in criminal justice before. Do you mind talking a little bit about the criminal and immigration settings and what the similarities and differences are?
Sure. Well, first I'll start with these settings are incredibly similar. For example, when we think about both the criminal and immigration context, people are locked up for all our clients here at CAIR Coalition. In the cases of the clients I've worked with, humans are literally behind bars. So when you hear of the in cages description, you hear a lot in the news, it's really an accurate description. And then again, similarly, people are being placed into courtrooms in the immigration context, or sometimes are just being essentially video chatted into courtrooms and are expected to be legal experts without having any access to the outside world or research or legal resources while they're in these proceedings. And then beyond that, of course, the stakes are so incredibly high. And I think that's true in both the criminal and immigration court. The outcome of these hearings will absolutely determine the trajectory of that person's entire life. When you're thinking about the consequences, from where they'll live to how they'll live to if they'll live at all. In the criminal context, we've recognized the right to an attorney. And as a society, we've come to understand why someone in that situation does need an attorney to be sure that at a minimum, due process is being met. The US Supreme Court describes the right to appointed counsel as necessary to ensure fundamental human rights of life and liberty. But somehow, that same standard does not apply to a person in immigration detention. But at the end of the day, when we're thinking about the realities of the person's day-to-day life, jail is jail.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, in immigration court, we're often working alongside clients who don't speak English, or at most don't speak English as their native language. And so on top of all of the things that Laura just mentioned, the incarceration, the legal complexity, and the high stakes, which are similar to the criminal context, there is also that language barrier in the immigration context that adds so much more difficulties for the clients. And to be clear, only 5% of the people who won relief in immigration court between 2007 and 2012 did so with an attorney. 90% of the wins were attorney wins. And surely since 2012, things have only gotten narrower and more complicated. I think your webinar last week about the state of asylum explained very well that the number might even be worse now.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for bringing that up. I think, we did do a webinar maybe 3 weeks ago now called Inside Immigration Court that talks a lot about translation and interpretation and what it means to be going through these proceedings, not only video called in, like Laura said, but also in a language that is not like native to someone, like Lorna said. And then in addition to that, our webinar last week, the state of asylum, definitely talks about those recent changes and how it's gotten more complicated. So thank you guys both for bringing up those points. I think with all of that in mind, I really want to talk about what universal representation looks like. So Lorna, can you just give me like an overview of what these programs are and yeah, just what universal rep even is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bridget, you mentioned when we first started that 86% of detained immigrants do not have legal representation, which means that about 40,000 or more people are in immigration court each year with no type of counsel. And the reason for that, as you said, is that there is no right to appointed counsel in immigration court, meaning you will not have an attorney by your side unless you can pay for one, or an organization like CAIR Coalition gets involved. And as you know, CAIR Coalition has incredibly limited funding. So we represent a lot of people, but it's a drop in the bucket of all the people who are detained and are going through this alone. In response to that jarring truth, some jurisdictions locally have put into place universal representation pilot programs. And what that means is that there's some amount of funding available from those local governments for me, for Laura, and a number of our other colleagues to take cases of people specifically from those jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. And those jurisdictions are Baltimore City in Maryland, Prince George's County, also in Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Fairfax, Virginia. For now, we don't have funding to represent everyone, and it's only a pilot program. So what we do is we randomly select people from who are assigned to our jurisdiction so that it's equitable. So for example, everyone who came into contact with DC, we just make sure that they meet the basic requirements, and then we will take their names, put them into a list, a machine that will randomly select names for us. Mm-hmm. And then we'll be able to represent some of these individuals. Laura does the same with her people from Prince George's County. Okay. And then, of course, if and when more funding becomes available, we could hypothetically expand to the point that we could try to truly represent everyone from that jurisdiction. And that's what we'd like to work towards, true universal representation.
Yeah, and to that point, Lorna, something that's really exciting that's been in the works for a very long time and is finally coming to life is that Prince George's County, alongside Immigration Justice Corps, has funded full universal representation for anyone from Prince George's County who is in DICE detention. Starting this fall of 2020, we won't have to pull names randomly anymore because CAIR Coalition, along with Immigration Justice Corps, will be able to represent everyone we come into contact with who is from Prince George's County. That is a huge first step, and we're very excited that we're moving in that direction.
Okay, so that's really awesome and unique because I think, as Lorna was talking about, these have all been pilot programs where we're just kind of pulling a random assortment. So that is really making it a blanket. So are there other jurisdictions that have that blanket already alive?
Yeah, so actually New York had the country's first publicly funded universal representation program in the nation. And actually, under the New York universal representation model, detained immigrants in New York City saw the odds of winning their cases increase by 1,100%, meaning they were 11 times as likely to win in their cases. That was based on an evaluation done by the Vera Institute of Justice. And I think one of the most important pieces of that is, as Lorna was saying, universal representation means you represent everyone without barring anyone because of the facts of their life. So for example, you guys did a webinar last week on asylum and how there are these fairly narrow protected grounds that someone has to fit into to qualify for asylum. Well, under universal representation, even if we're talking to someone and they don't fit neatly into one of those categories, maybe their fear or their family or their story doesn't match up as neatly with the state of the law as it is today, we don't turn them away. And then despite that, you'll still see an 1,100% increase. So as Vera said in their report, that just points to how universal representation does generate positive outcomes for clients, even when initially such outcomes maybe were thought improbable without representation.
So that's really counterintuitive, I think. I just want to harp on that for a second, because we have this idea that there's some screening process or some kind of, way that we could filter people or, talk to people and understand the basic facts that would be helpful or make representation more efficient. And what you just said, and what Vera found in this report that they did is that universal representation actually demonstrates that those screening processes maybe don't have the capacity to predict, the outcomes of a case and the legal complexities and the likelihood of success. So I think in light of that, I kind of do want to start talking about the clients alongside whom, you all work and what those cases do look like. So Lorna, you mentioned that, you'll put everyone into a pipeline as long as they meet kind of basic requirements. So what are those basic requirements? What qualifications does someone have to meet to enter that UREP bucket?
So anyone who had previous residency in their respective jurisdiction is eligible. So anyone who recently lived in DC, Fairfax, Baltimore, or Prince George's County. Okay. And we also make sure that they can't afford an attorney. Okay. Since we have limited resources, we have to prioritize the people who can't afford their own attorney. But realistically speaking, that's everyone, since being detained means everyone loses their source of income, and so many of our clients are making ends meet by working extremely hard and living paycheck to paycheck anyway. So very few get disqualified for income reasons. In general, we see clients who have been here for a long while, and some have roots in the area, though it's a mix, of course, and having ties here or being new here should not be a reason someone should receive legal representation or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So the folks alongside whom you work, your clients, how do a lot of them report that they ended up in ICE detention in the first place?
So the people that we see in DC, for example, they come into ICE custody in a lot of different ways. Sometimes through ICE check-in appointments, sometimes through ICE raids, at home, work, in the community. And sometimes they come in through the criminal justice system. And that brings me to a point that I think is important. So for at least the cases that we see in DC and in Fairfax that come through the criminal justice system, the majority of those charges and convictions are for poverty crimes, things like property damage, trespassing, and petty larceny. The vast majority of those individuals who are being arrested for these types of situations then end up in ICE detention, and they are usually Hispanic or Latin. There are studies that discuss these trends. ACLU Fairfax has done one of these studies, and people who face the particular socioeconomic difficulties that lead to these types of arrests are at heightened risk of detention by ICE. And this points to systematic racism. This shows who is at a greater risk of being picked up by ICE for minor crimes and who isn't. One reason UREP is so important to my clients is because we understand that sometimes they come into contact with ICE officers because they don't have the resources that they need. And without basic resources, they end up being vulnerable targets to these officers. UREP looks at the person and their situation as a whole and tries to connect them with the appropriate resources. We work with them to create post-release plans where we connect them with our community partners who provide our clients with housing, mental health services, family services, and anything else that they might need. Also, on another note, according to our clients, many of them are picked up either at home, at work, while driving, while walking in the street. And a smaller percentage are targeted at court or a probation office or an ICE office, for example.
Okay.
Yeah, and to Lorna's point about how some people get taken into ICE custody from a small interaction with law enforcement, Prince George's County has taken some really impressive steps to protect the immigrant community. The county council unanimously voted for the Community Inclusiveness Act, which limits any county official's ability to interact with ICE. So before that, there were some instances of immigrants having an interaction with local police, even related to getting into a car accident and asking the police to come help, and then landing in ICE detention. And of course, that means that immigrants are less likely to call the police if they are victims of a crime or serve as witnesses when there are consequences to that. But Prince George's County Council worked really speedily to pass that act, which is just another example of how Prince George's County really is a leader in the region on these issues. So we definitely want to thank Prince George's County Council, and in particular, Council Member Denny Taveras, for spearheading these initiatives and being a champion for immigrant rights and protecting them.
Okay, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that, as we acknowledge kind of all of the ways that these different systems interact with each other, it's also very, good to acknowledge when those, interactions are kind of interrupted. So definitely thank you to Prince George's County Council, for their contribution to that end. So to return to to when folks do end up in ICE detention, it sounds like there's a variety of ways people end up in ICE detention, but ultimately, I guess my next question would be like, what does ICE detention look like? Like, what does that mean?
Honestly, that might be worth its entire own webinar. But
maybe so.
First, yeah, if you want another idea. But firstly, some of the detention centers in which CAIR Coalition works are full jails that have been bought by ICE and contracted out to a private company to run. So they're designed as a jail, right? They look entirely like a jail. Those jails hold only folks who are there for their immigration system and the proceedings.
Okay.
Some of the other detention centers in which CAIR Coalition works are county jails that ICE just rents out beds in. Either way, though, the building is a jail, the staff is jail staff, and it runs much like any other jail I've seen working in the criminal system. I think people generally know the rest. People are detained away from family. They have to wear a jumpsuit, and they're watched by a supervisor, whether they're in a dorm with many other adults or a cell with just them and one or two other people. They're in there 24 hours a day without any freedom. At some detention centers, folks have designated time to go outside, whether that's once a day or a few times a week.
How does that affect your ability to represent that client?
CAIR Coalition has these little buttons that say justice detained is justice denied. And I think that's a really good place to start. CAIR Coalition does really amazing work, but ultimately, when people are detained hours away from the city, when they can't have regular contact with family or friends outside of detention, the barriers to getting information and being sure we're putting together the best case possible with all the relevant evidence are huge. Right. Still, like we said earlier, 95% of the wins in immigration court are people who do have an attorney. So universal representation can still mitigate a lot of these negative barriers.
Okay, so it sounds like, there's plenty of need for representation and ultimately freedom. It sounds like, Lorna, I think a statistic that you repeated earlier was that only 5% of wins in immigration court, are without an attorney. So, it kind of sounds like maybe one of the only ways to get out of detention or to win relief is with representation. So what types of cases do you guys end up taking? So Laura, do you mind starting and telling us a little bit about some of your clients?
Of course. So I'll keep everything anonymous, but one client that comes to mind is an individual who has suffered from serious mental health illness, who was selected for representation, that entered the US when he was about 14 years old. That's almost 20 years ago. He has been in and out of ICE custody for the past decade, and only recently was placed into removal proceedings in court following an improper removal order that we were able to finally terminate. Since, just for more context, since 2011, he had a removal order, but he didn't have an understanding of immigration court proceedings or any forms of relief available to him, or what was going on even when he was checking with his deportation officer. Because he has been homeless, he was abandoned by his family, he had no support system, and has been suffering from severe mental health illness for the majority of his life. We're now representing him for his asylum claim, which would never have even been possible without someone advocating for him in this court system. Another client we've had where we recently won a grant of withholding of removal is an individual who fled Guatemala almost 15 years ago after refusing to join a gang and resisting gang recruitment efforts. Cases like his not only serve to benefit our clients, but will also have a significant impact as a whole for immigration and people in immigration court proceedings. Because this case is one of the first grants of fear-based relief recognizing refusal of gang recruitment as a political opinion. So really, when we're advocating and making these arguments, it's not just about our clients, but it's about educating the judges and the immigration court system as a whole for other individuals who may not have access to representation.
Yeah, so it sounds like with at least that last case, there's like some future implications that other people can then take that argument, you know, and keep using it. Lorna, what about some of the clients you see in DC?
I had one client who suffered from mental health illnesses that he attributed to some of the trauma and violence that he witnessed as a very young child. And we took that case to trial, and during trial, I asked him about one of the symptoms of his mental illness, which was hearing voices. I asked him why he couldn't ignore the voice and what it was telling him to do. It was giving him bad advice, and why he couldn't just ignore that advice. And what he said was that hearing the voice was like someone putting headphones on and turning up the volume. You just can't ignore it. And I think that the most important aspect of representation, in the representation that I provided to him, was that I truly took the time to understand what was going on in his life and what kind of trauma he experienced, so that I could ask him the pertinent questions in my direct questioning during trial that would elicit that response in front of the judge. Right. And when you have a client who has experienced so much trauma in their life, during an asylum case, it's important to understand the depth of the damage that the trauma has had on that client. It's hard for a judge who has not spent time with that client before on a one-on-one basis to be able to elicit this kind of detail that's important for their claim. And, you know, this happens when a respondent is unrepresented by counsel. Like in my client's case, the judge would not have understood the behavior that was caused by the trauma. So having representation really helps to tell the judge the client's story during these proceedings where they're dealing with complete strangers who more often than not, you know, aren't speaking your language. They don't understand your language, and you're nervous just because of the high stakes of the proceedings. Right. But on a lighter note, I had another client who came to the US over a decade ago seeking asylum. He worked 24/7, juggling several jobs at the same time. He was clearly a hard worker, and we were able to win bond for him. But unfortunately, based on the cost of living in DC, he wasn't able to save enough money to be able to pay his bond by the time he had won. So we hustled and we reached out to our community friends, Sanctuary DMV and the Seville Bond Fund, and we were able to raise the funds in less than 3 days. So the client was able to get out so quickly after winning his hearing. And it was amazing. It was incredible. And my client is a man who always has a lot to say. Since I met him, he's never been a quiet person, but for the first time ever, when he learned that we were able to pay the bond, he was truly speechless, and it was amazing.
That's awesome. I'd also like to add that sometimes, because of the way the laws are so narrow and detention is so fatiguing, some people do decide to opt for deportation or voluntary departure, or have no other choice and are forced in that direction. And even then, because of universal representation, we facilitate that and add dignity to the process of deportation. For example, we recently represented an individual who arrived to the US when he was about 6 years old and was preparing for deportation, unfortunately, after serving 25 years in prison for a conviction he received when he was just a child, about 15 years old. He was then immediately transferred to an ICE detention center. He needed a lot of assistance, understandably, connecting with resources available to him when he was going to arrive in Honduras, as well as helping his family prepare his travel documentation for him, and just a general understanding of what life is like in the free world after 25 years, which the process isn't set up for that kind of those kind of answers to those questions or reentry assistance in that manner. We were able to answer a lot of questions for both him and his family and provide a much more humane deportation process than would have otherwise been available to him.
Thank you guys so much for sharing all of those. I think, that represents what you guys just articulated, represents kind of a wide range of universal rep cases and kind of like the, just trying to mitigate some of the issues that might exist in a deportation where someone might be very confused, articulating people's story and pulling out the details like Lorna talked about. I've seen you guys do that. And it's like just so, important and impressive and human. And then also those connections with those community contacts that were able to raise that bond in 3 days. I do just want to highlight for anyone watching this, we do have infrastructure so that if a group of people, whether that's just like you and some friends or your extended family or a congregation or a formal club, like if a group is interested in raising bond funds or is interested in kind of like working with CAIR Coalition in that way, we do have infrastructure available to kind of connect people to clients and make that happen. So I just want to highlight that. And if anyone's interested, they should, reach out to CAIR Coalition via comments, Instagram DMs, slip into our DMs and let us know because we're very ready to facilitate that. So thank you guys so much for explaining all of that. I kind of just want to talk a little bit about how coronavirus is affecting the work that you're doing. I guess, Lorna, we'll start with you. How has your work changed recently?
In light of everything, our team is working harder than ever to prioritize the release of our clients from detention. Obviously, in the context of universal representation, I'm focused on ensuring that our DC immigrant neighbors can get out. But on a larger scale, I think every single attorney at CAIR Coalition is working constantly and pushing for release. Since about mid-March, we have advocated for 8 DC residents at bond hearings, and we filed maybe a dozen humanitarian release requests directly to ICE. So we're also pursuing litigation, meaning a bigger overarching lawsuit against ICE to protect those who are most vulnerable to COVID-19 in detention. In that big lawsuit, 2 of the people who are named are DC residents. For the people who have been released, we have been referring them successfully to DC Volunteer Lawyers Project to be sure that they will have continued legal representation even though they're no longer detained.
That is so much. Thank you for sharing all of that. Laura, can you speak a little bit to the Maryland side and what's going on in Maryland?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lorna really hit the nail on the head, just saying everyone at CAIR Coalition really is just working constantly on our cases. And of course, the cases are only made harder by not being able to go to jail and see our clients in person. I know personally speaking, I've completed like 2 full hearings, and just it's incredibly hard to get in touch with our clients in detention without visiting or having extensive time getting their stories. So it's been incredibly hard to talk to clients and getting all the details necessary for these hearings. It's also been hard to get in touch with DHS attorneys because we don't see them in court regularly now. And we're all kind of operating on this like limited status. There are also tons of obstacles just communicating with our clients and getting evidence from their families since we can't go see them. This is a hard time for everyone. It's hard to also get families to have enough time to find documentation. There's also a lot of important documents related to individual cases that we just can't get right now. Criminal court systems are also down and limited, operating in a limited capacity. So it's just, I think it's been incredibly hard to do our job, which is to pull all the information together and communicate with everyone constantly from all these separate spaces.
Yeah, I think that, hearing you guys talk about this and talking about, justice detained is already justice denied, and then justice detained plus not being able to visit plus a pandemic, I just think it's a lot, and it's very impressive that these universal representation teams are still pushing through in the absence of kind of like bigger broader changes. It's like really fantastic to hear that this work is still ongoing. So I just want to thank you guys so much again for taking all of the time to explain all of this to me, to explain the New York system, to explain that screening processes maybe don't catch everything, and just kind of the amazing impact of universal representation and how important it is. And of course, if anyone watching has any questions or wants to support this work, we're going to link tons of resources in the comments, tons of more information about how the criminal justice system interacts with the immigration system. But if you want to support people who have been detained by ICE and who are from your local jurisdiction, CAIRCO has UREP teams that we are ready for your support. So I will link resources, but thank you guys, Lorna and Laura. Thank you guys so much again for talking about this today.
It was our pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah.